We started a conversation last week about a character from the Old Testament named Jacob. And Jacob is one of those characters that we read about in the Old Testament. And what you learn if you read about his life carefully is that he's not really the hero of faith that we read about in some other stories. A lot of times we read about Bible characters and we see their incredible faith. We see their incredible acts of sacrifice, and we aspire to be like them. But we look at those folks, we think, I'll never be like Moses. I can never be like Abraham, or I can never be like, and you fill in the blank of the person. Jacob is not that at all. Jacob is not heroic. Jacob, throughout the entire story, all the chapters we have of him, is somebody who kind of stumbles and bumbles along, which means that he's pretty relatable to all of us normal people. Like, we can relate to Jacob because he is not somebody whose faith is ever held up as the example we should all follow. So we've started a series about Jacob called Grasping for God, because that's exactly what Jacob is doing throughout his entire life. He is grasping for God. He is clawing his way to God. And week after week, we are learning that despite of all of Jacob's efforts, despite all of his misguided attempts, it is God who is in fact pursuing Jacob. So last week we started by looking at Genesis chapter 27. Today we're going to be in Genesis 28. If you have a Bible, you can go and open there with me. But we saw Jacob at the very beginning of this story as he was grasping after trying to get his father's blessing. Now, we don't use the term blessing this way today, but really what he wanted is what so many of us have wanted. In fact, I would say all of us have tried to get it, is somebody's approval. Maybe it's a father or a mother's approval, or a boss or a coach or a teacher, somebody. We've all had that experience where we have desperately tried to get somebody's approval. Jacob wanted more than anything to get his dad's approval. He wanted to get his dad's blessing, so much so that he was willing to lie and cheat and steal it from his older brother. And so that's exactly what he did. He grasped for his father's blessing, he got it, and he ended up blowing his entire family up. We saw that this basically put a wedge between he and his brother. It put a wedge between his brother and the rest of the family. And now what we're going to see this week is that after Jacob did that thing, now he's on the run. He's alone, he's disgraced, he's disinherited. The last thing he heard from his mother's lips was, you better get out of here because your brother's going to kill you. The last thing he saw was the hatred in his brother Esau's eyes. The last thing he felt was the crushing weight of knowing that his father had blessed him, but that blessing wasn't really for him. He didn't approve of him. And what we learned last week is that Jacob got what he wanted, but lost everything he needed in the process. You ever been there? You ever been willing to sacrifice what you needed to get what you wanted? The answer is yes, we've all done it. That we are willing to sacrifice the thing we need the most to get the thing we want the most, only to find out the thing that we want the most really doesn't help us at all. That's exactly what he's done. And now he is running away from his family. He's got nowhere to go. He's heard the words from his father that he always wanted to hear, but not the joy of knowing that those words were really for him. He wore the costume, he looked the part, but he never felt seen. He grasped for the blessing, and he ended up face down in the dirt. And that's where we pick up the story this week. Jacob is on the run, and Jacob, in this moment in his life, is not looking for God. He is not trying to find the Lord in this moment. He is only running away from his consequences, the consequences of his own grasping. He's deceived his father. He's betrayed his brother. He's fractured his family. Now, in the middle of nowhere, with only a rock for a pillow, Jacob collapses into a sleep. From utter exhaustion, emotionally and physically. And so in Genesis 28, we begin with Jacob grasping for a future. He is trying to find some hope. He can't go back home. He has no idea where he is going. But all he finds right here in this place, in this dark, is that the gates of heaven appear to be shut. The doors of heaven appear to be closed to him. You ever been there? You've been in that place in your life, in your journey, where it just seemed like heaven, if it was even real, was nowhere close to you? You couldn't access it. Maybe it was at a time of great difficulty and struggle. Maybe it was a financial crisis. Maybe it was a relationship crisis. Maybe your marriage was falling apart. Your kids were falling apart. Maybe you lost your job. I don't know what it was for you, but maybe there was this moment where it just felt like heaven was so far away from you. In fact, heaven wasn't even really on your mind. But what we see in this story is so important for all of us to realize That what happens next in Jacob's life changed everything, not just for Jacob, but ultimately it has the power to change it for us too. Because what we see in Jacob's story is that heaven is not far above us, but heaven breaks in to the dirt beneath our feet. That God's future arrives in Jacob's failure. That God shows up to Jacob when Jacob isn't looking for him, and that he announces that the gates of heaven are closer than Jacob thinks, and they're open for him. So let's start in Genesis 28, beginning in verse 10, when heaven feels closed to Jacob. Look what it says in Genesis chapter 28, verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and laid down to sleep. Now, the author of Genesis is incredibly concise in his language. He uses words to tell us a lot of information in just a couple verses. So from just these couple verses, the author gives us three important clues about Jacob's condition. First of all, it says that he reached a certain place. The name of the place isn't given because to Jacob, this is a nowhere place. It's not home, it's not where he was, it's not where he's going, it's not where he wants to be. It's just sort of a nowhere place somewhere in the middle. That's where he is. He may not even be fully aware of where he is in that moment. It's a nowhere place. The second clue the author gives us is that the sun had set. Now, the author isn't just telling us the time of day it is. The author is telling us that hope is fading for Jacob. His future is dim. The author is painting a picture here that says the sun is setting, there isn't a lot of hope, there isn't a lot of time left. And the third thing he says, which may be the most incredible thing of all, is that he used a rock for a pillow. Now think about this. If you were traveling and you were needing to camp out, you would use almost anything you had to put under your head. So what this tells us is that Jacob in this moment had nothing. He left home in such a hurry, he had nothing else. So all that he could find was a rock, and he used the rock as a pillow. So up to this point, we have no record in Scripture that Jacob ever had a conversation with God. We don't have any evidence that Jacob was ever seeking after God. Everyone before Jacob to this point has had a conversation with God. Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, sought after the Lord, and we see in conversations between Abraham and God. We saw even in Jacob's dad, Isaac, that Isaac sought after the Lord, and God spoke to Isaac. We even saw Jacob's mother, Rebekah, has had conversations and interaction with the Lord, but we've never seen it. Jacob isn't looking for God. He's not praying. He's not building altars. He is just trying to survive. In fact, he might say, I don't have time for God right now. I mean, this is where he is. He doesn't have time to build a fancy altar or to try to get himself together and get all these religious rituals down. He doesn't have time for any of it. He is just simply trying to make it day by day by day. And in the midst of this, it feels like heaven is moving farther and farther away from him. He is spiritually unaware, emotionally exhausted, and he's morally compromised. And it is in that moment, right here in this place, that God shows up to him anyway. And this is a pattern that we see time and time again in the Scripture. If you read the Scripture from the beginning all the way in, what you find is that God tends to appear to people when they least expect it, and when we would say they are the furthest away from God in that moment. Think about some of the characters that we looked at throughout the Bible. Think about Moses, for example. Moses was a fugitive. He had killed a man. He's running from Pharaoh. He's in the desert. All he can do is be a shepherd for his father-in-law, a job that he has done year in and year out, and it's in the middle of that place that God shows up to him through the burning bush. Think about the prophet Elijah. He's the only prophet, or so he thinks. He's the only prophet left in Israel. He's depressed. He's discouraged. He goes up on a mountain, and he really wants to commit suicide. He says, God, take my life from me. And it's in that moment, at his lowest point, that God shows up to him. Think about two disciples in the New Testament who had been to Jerusalem and they had seen Jesus crucified, and all their dreams, all their hopes had been completely dashed, and they're walking away from Jerusalem and their heads are downcast, and all of a sudden a stranger walks up to them and starts talking to them and explaining the Scriptures to them, and eventually they open their eyes and realize that was Jesus who showed up. The resurrected Jesus had showed up. God comes to us in these places. He doesn't wait for us to find him. He shows up in the middle of our mess. that he comes to us when we least expect it. What if heaven is never closer than when it feels the most distant? What if heaven is closer to you in the middle of the distraction and the pain and the suffering? What if heaven is closer to you in the shame? What if heaven is closer to you in those moments than even when you sit here and sing songs about heaven? What if this is how God chooses to work in your life? To reveal himself to you, not when you have it all together, not when you're at your best, but when you're at your lowest. Because that's exactly what happens. And so we see in verse 12 and following what happens when heaven breaks in. Look at verse 12. So Jacob had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reach to heaven. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord. Now, if you grew up going to Sunday school as a kid, you might have had a Sunday school lesson about Jacob's ladder. This is that story. This amazing ladder or this stairway that showed up. And in this dream that he has, this vision that he has, Jacob sees three things. The first thing he sees is a stairway. This stairway or this ladder is connecting heaven and earth. Now, don't miss this. This is so critically important. In fact, this becomes a critical image that Jesus will use to describe his mission later in the New Testament. This stairway is connecting heaven to earth. Part of the message here is heaven is not far away. That heaven, in fact, does touch earth. There are thin spaces and thin places. There is a sacred seam where the eternal can pierce the ordinary. You've probably experienced this. Maybe it was the birth of a child and the first time you held that new baby. Or maybe it was as you stood up and exchanged vows with your spouse. Or maybe for you it was a vacation and everything was perfect and you saw an incredible sunrise or a beautiful sunset. And there are these places where it seems like the veil between heaven and earth grows really thin. But that's not the only time that happens. We want those times. Those are the times we want. But there are other times that happens too. Like when you're standing at the deathbed of somebody you love and the veil grows thin. There are times in the middle of pain and suffering and loss when the seam wears thin and you begin to see glimpses of heaven. See, part of what Jacob is seeing, part of what God is revealing to Jacob is that I'm closer than you think I am, and heaven is a closer reality to you right now than you may know. That heaven sometimes appears in the ordinary places, in the painful places of our life. The second thing he sees in this vision is angels ascending and descending. They're going up and down. And so it's a busy stairway. Like if you think about it like an escalator in an office building, or you see just people going up and down and up and down, up and down. This is the image that he's got of these angels. Now, what are angels? It's not just these beautiful winged creatures we see on Hallmark cards. These are messengers of God. In fact, the Bible describes them as pretty fearsome creatures of God. And they're going up and down. What is this image? This image is God is working. Messengers, angels of God only move at his bidding. And what is happening? They are moving. God is active. God is doing something. God is always at work around us, even when we don't recognize it, even when we don't see it. And so for a moment, Jacob realizes that these angels are moving. God is on the move. He's not passive. He's present. He's working. And the third thing he sees is the Lord standing over him. Now, some translations say that the Lord is standing over it, meaning the stairway or the ladder. Some translations say he's standing over him. Either way, it's the same. That as Jacob is laying there, looking up at this stairway, God is above it. So he's above the stairs, he's above him, and there he is. God is watching. He's presiding. And he is about to speak to Jacob, even though Jacob has never spoken to him. Listen to what it says in verse 13, how God says, God said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All the people on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you. Now, this is a pretty incredible message that God is giving to Jacob in this moment. And if it sounds familiar, it should. Because the first thing he says to Jacob is, I am the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. This same blessing had been repeated to Jacob's grandfather and to his dad. But God is identifying himself not just with Jacob's ancestors, but with Jacob's future. Notice what he says, I am the God of your father Abraham and Isaac, but I am also your God, and I will, future tense, I will bless you. He is the God of Jacob's future. In this moment, grace isn't just something that he talks about that his parents received or that his grandparents received. Grace becomes personal for Jacob in this moment. This is the beginning of his relationship with God, and it was God who initiated it. It wasn't Jacob. The second thing he hears is that God says, I will give you and your descendants the land. All people on earth will be blessed for you. This is the promise, this is the covenant that God made with Abraham. Remember, sin had entered into the picture. The world was broken. We saw the downward spiral of the world from Genesis 3 to Genesis 11. And then in Genesis 12, God picks one man and he says, I'm going to bless you, and through you, I'm going to bless your family, and that family's going to become a nation. I'm going to bless it. And through that nation, I'm going to bring about the redemption of all the world. This is the promise God has made. And so he is saying, I am still going to do this. The same promise that had been given to Abraham now rests on Jacob. Not because Jacob had earned it. Not because he had lived a stellar life to this moment, but because God is faithful. Even when we fall short, God continues to be faithful. And the third thing God says to him is, I am with you. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. God gives Jacob his presence before Jacob gives God his obedience. Don't miss that. God gives Jacob the gift of his presence, the gift of himself, before Jacob is ever obedient back to God. See, here's what we think, and here's what religion often teaches. I do my part, and then God does his part. Which in some ways, if you think about it, makes us God, because we control the outcome. I am obedient, and then God is obligated to respond to my obedience with his blessing. That is not the message that we see in Jacob's life or throughout the Bible. In fact, it is God who takes the initiative. God gives Jacob the blessing of himself first before Jacob has ever been obedient. Some of you have grown up thinking that you are not in the right place for God to speak to you, for God to reveal himself to you, because you haven't done enough. You haven't been good enough. That maybe if you could just get your act together, if you could do things right, then maybe God will speak to you. I would invite you to look at Jacob's life. Jacob hasn't done anything right to this moment. And yet God speaks to him because that's what grace does. This is the gospel in advance. Grace comes first. Jacob discovers that grace is not given at the finish line. Grace meets us when we're at the rock bottom. Grace meets us when we're at our worst. And so here, in this moment, in this nowhere place with only a stone for a pillow, heaven breaks open. Not because Jacob climbed the ladder himself, but because God, get this, God descends the ladder and comes to Jacob. And this is what is so important for us to understand. Because this whole idea, this concept, this image that Jacob has in this vision becomes an important thing that Jesus points to later on when he's calling his disciples. John starts his gospel off by telling us that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And as Jesus is calling his disciples, he says this to his disciples in John 1:51. He says this, "You will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." What is Jesus talking about? Jesus is talking about what happened in Genesis 28 when Jacob had this vision of this heavenly stairway and the angels ascending and descending. And the reality, the revelation is, it was about me. I am the God who was at the top of the ladder, the top of the stairway, and I have come down to be with you in the dirt. I have come down to be with you in the brokenness. I have come down to enter into this fallen world. God is not waiting on us to bridge the gap of our sin and brokenness to get to him. It's a fool's errand anyway. You can never do it. Instead, he has crossed the gap and come to us. Jesus is saying, I am the stairway. I am the ladder. I'm the connection. I am the meeting place of heaven and earth. Heaven and earth begin to touch and collide in the person of Jesus Christ. And so what we see at the end of this passage is what happens when heaven changes you. Look with me at verse 16 and following. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Now, this is a pretty amazing thing. He wakes up and he's blown away. He didn't expect to find God here. He even admits that. God was in this place and I wasn't aware of it. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up on a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the place Bethel, which means the house of God, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, now listen to this. I love that this is included. I love that the author of Genesis did not take this out, because this shows that Jacob still has a long way to go in his faith. Because listen to what he says. He says this, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you have given me I will give you a tenth." Do you notice what he's doing? Like, God has just shown up to him as evidence of his grace and his pursuit of him. And what does Jacob do? Jacob says, okay, well, let's just see. If you keep providing me the food I need and the clothes I need, if you bring me back to my father's house, if everything works out the way I want it to, then I will call you my God. And then I will give you 1/10 of everything I have. Like, he doesn't get it. He's still in this moment. He still doesn't really understand that this had nothing to do with him and his good works. This had everything to do with God's faithfulness. He wakes up and he's stunned. Surely the Lord is in this place and I didn't know it. And this is a confession of someone who thought that heaven was completely inaccessible until heaven came to him. He thought that God was distant until God came to find him. And that's what grace does. Grace reveals God was there all along, in the pain, in the exile, in the failure, that God doesn't abandon us when we're at our lowest. In fact, God draws near to those who are lowly. Jacob said, this is none other than the house of God. This is a gate of heaven. What is he talking about? What's changed? Because this was just a desert place, a nowhere place. He didn't have anything but a rock to put his head on. What changed? Not the place. Jacob's awareness changed. And it just makes me wonder how many times in my life when I've been at that nowhere place, that desert place, it wasn't that God wasn't there, it's just that I wasn't aware of it. I wasn't looking for him in those places. Heaven was not far off. Heaven was hidden in plain sight. So what does he do? He marks the place. He takes the very stone he slept on and he makes an altar and he names this place Bethel, the house of God. It's not a temple. It's not some fancy temple. It's just a patch of dirt. And there's only a rock for an altar. And Jacob marked that place. And he vows his devotion. He offers a tithe back to the Lord. It's imperfect faith, for sure. Definitely falls short. But it's a start. And it's his first real response to God. He is stumbling his way forward. And isn't that what God's looking for? Like, he wasn't even aware of God before this. And now at least he's aware of God. That God is pleased when we were willing to take our next step of faith, and that's exactly what he did here. He still wasn't perfect, but he was making progress. Jacob's still early on in the journey. In fact, we're going to follow him for the next few weeks, and we're going to see he's going to continue to stumble his way forward. But something has changed. Something has altered in his life. God has initiated a relationship, not because Jacob deserved it, but because God is faithful and because God is gracious. And one of the things I love about this story is that this isn't just the story of somebody's personal salvation. We could read this and we could think, oh, isn't that a great example of how God reached out to somebody who was far away from him and brought him close, and we see evidence of the salvation of Jacob through this story. It's more than that. It's so much bigger than that. This is a glimpse of the new creation. This is something significant that is going on in the biblical narrative, that God is replanting Eden in the desert. He is starting in this moment with this stairway to say, I am reclaiming this creation. That heaven is touching earth. Not through human achievement, like in Genesis 11, where people tried to build a tower to reach God. No, God, in fact, built the stairway to come down. It's divine descent. This is part of what the mission of the church is about. For far too long, I think the church has been confused and thought that the mission of the church was to get people into heaven. But what if the mission of the church is to get heaven into people? What if the mission of the church is about bringing the reality of heaven into people's lives in the middle of the brokenness, in the middle of the pain, so that heaven begins to transform us, not someday when we die, but heaven begins to transform us now. And that through us, the work of God, the work of grace in our lives begins to transform our families and begins to transform our workplaces and our communities and begins to transform so that God is working in and through his church, not just to evacuate people out, but to bring heaven in. Listen, heaven is not accessed by striving, but it's revealed by grace. You do not get to heaven by your efforts. Heaven comes to you as evidence of God's grace and love. Jacob saw a stairway, and Jesus said, I am the stairway. In Jesus, the ladder has been lowered. The gates have been opened. You don't have to find your way to God because he has found his way to you. He has come looking for you and seeking you. Jesus is the connection between heaven and earth, and the connection, the door, the gate has been swung open. What if the place you thought was a nowhere place? What if that season of your life that you thought was wasted time? What if the pain and the disappointment, what if the shame and the guilt was actually a doorway to heaven? What if God uses that place, that moment in your life, to reveal himself to you and to invite you to come to him? What if heaven isn't out there somewhere, but what if it's right here? See, here's what we do, and I know we do it because I do it. We are always looking for heaven somewhere else. We are looking for it somewhere else that isn't painful, somewhere else that isn't hard, somewhere else that isn't a challenge. But what if it's always closer? Because it's in the brokenness, it's in the pain, it's in the shame, it's in the guilt that God will reveal himself with grace and will draw you to himself. What if heaven is bursting through the cracks of your broken life and you didn't even know it? See, Jacob was surprised to find God in the middle of nowhere. Maybe you'll be shocked to find God in the middle of your current crisis. This is what the gospel is about. The gospel isn't about how we get to heaven. The gospel is about how heaven has come down, not for the deserving, but for the desperate, not for the righteous, but for the restless, not for the holy, but for the hungry. In Jesus, heaven is open. The gate is not locked. The ladder has been lowered. You don't have to fake it. You don't have to earn it. You just have to look up and receive it. And that's the invitation that was given to Jacob, and it's the invitation that's given to us. Stop grasping for heaven and be gripped by grace. Stop grasping for heaven. Stop grasping for his blessing. And instead let him take hold of you by his grace and his love. Name that place. Identify that location where you feel the farthest from God. Maybe it's in the middle of some secret sin that nobody else even knows about, and you think, I am farthest away from God when I am doing this sin, and I know it. But maybe, what if in that nowhere place where you feel farthest from God, in the middle of that sin, what if that's where you find him? What if that's where you see his grace? What if it's by the deathbed? What if it's in the divorce court? What if it's in bankruptcy? What if it's in loss? The Bible reminds us from the beginning of Genesis all the way through the end that God meets us not when we're at our strongest, but when we're at our weakest. Stop pretending. Stop performing. Stop trying to earn what's already been given to you in Jesus Christ.